Hey everybody, and welcome to the first ever St. Francis Youth Podcast. I am really pleased that you're able to join us for this first episode. During this very strange season of COVID-19, we thought this would be a good opportunity to spend some time going deeper into some of the topics that you thought would be most helpful. At the top of this list for you is the topic, why and how should I read the Bible? How can I enjoy it? How can I hear God speak to me through it? So the first few podcast episodes are going to be devoted to this very topic. And I thought a good place to start would be to think about how we can even trust the Bible. Some would say that it's a fairy tale, a complete work of fiction. Others will take every word literally and allow it to influence how they think and feel and act about everything. So if we can trust the Bible, what does that actually mean? So I dragged a friend in who has thought very deeply about this issue, John Nelson. John has been studying the Bible academically for the past 4 years, gaining a master's from Oxford, and is looking to take that further to PhD level. His passion is particularly in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, these 4 accounts of the life of Jesus. So he will help us really to think about how these documents are trustworthy. John is a good friend, but we first met over 7 years ago at my interview to become a youth worker in Harrow. He was a young person and I really enjoyed having John in the youth group. Frankly, he was a nightmare at times. He would ask very complex and very deep questions about God and the Bible, which honestly, I think I enjoyed quite a lot. And I hope you find this conversation with him very helpful. But before we get to John, here is what you had to say on the topic of, is the Bible trustworthy?
I think the Bible is definitely trustworthy because although it can be confusing and you have to take parts metaphorically, I think the relevance it has today when it was written such a long time ago shows how it's inspired by God and not just this random book.
The Bible is trustworthy, but you shouldn't go following it exactly by the book, because not everything is meant literally. For example, you've got the expression love thy neighbour. It doesn't mean actually love thy neighbour, it just means do something nice for them or other people.
I generally think that the Bible is trustworthy because I think that God would have guided the authors in what they are writing, especially for the Gospels, even though they are written years after the events. I think that God has the power to remind the authors of exactly what happened, and they are all fairly similar. However, I do think that because the Bible has been translated so many times, the true meaning can sometimes be lost or changed.
I do think the Bible is trustworthy. When it comes down to it, I believe that it's the Word of God, and we should follow it and take notice of what it's saying because everything in there is written for a reason. It's difficult. Sometimes I do find myself doubting it, especially with all the controversy around certain verses. But yeah, I believe that we should be trusting it.
Yes, there are things in there that, looking at it from our perspective, don't make an awful lot of sense. But we have to remember when and how this book was written, because it's not just one book, it's a collection of many, and you have to read them as they are, as individual books, not as, or not solely anyway, as the Bible as a whole. So yeah, it's completely trustworthy.
I believe that the Bible is trustworthy because it's been studied by lots of people and it aligns with all the historical records at the time, as well as the fact that I simply refuse to believe that a third of the world's population, which is the fraction of the earth that are Christian, I refuse to believe that a third of the world has a religion that is built on a book of nonsense. So, yeah.
There we go. John Nelson, mate, it's so good to have you on our first ever podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. John, do you want to just tell us a little bit? No, it's great. Do you want to tell us a little bit about where you are at the moment? Because it sounds amazing.
So 2 weeks ago, I was in school because I'm training to be a secondary school teacher in religious education. And I was told by university to say goodbye to my students, which I did the next day. And so I was pulled out of school because of the virus. And now I'm in Northern Ireland. My friends just invited me up. So I'm currently quarantined, having a great quarantine in Northern Ireland.
Quarantine.
Doing lots of, yes.
Nice. And you were saying that you've just basically loaded up a car of books, and you're just kind of living the scholar life at the moment as well.
I've got all of my C.S. Lewis books, all of my New Testament books, which is what we're going to be talking about today, and doing lots of reading. Yeah.
Nice, living the dream. Oh, mate, it's so good to have you join us. John was in my youth group back in the day. You were actually at my job interview for the youth worker role at Harrow. Do you remember the one question you asked me at the job interview?
Was it whether you liked Coldplay?
Yeah, it was whether I liked Coldplay. And I think I was just like, kind of. Which, you know.
I've actually gone off them quite a bit. I think early Coldplay was much better than
You've
than
changed.
They've sold out.
A hardcore fan.
I was.
Sold out. Goodness. So tell us a little bit about. So you've just finished doing a master's before your teacher training. Tell us a little bit about what you were doing your master's in.
So I did a BA in biblical studies. Clearly, having such great mentors during my youth, decided I wanted to study the Bible. So I went off to Nottingham. And then after that, I had a little bit of time in London, and I was working partly as a research assistant and also a teaching assistant at the London School of Theology. And then I went to Oxford to do an MST in New Testament studies. So that was mostly focusing on the canonical Gospels and asking various historical and literary questions about those texts. Shall I share some memories before we start about my time in youth group?
Only if they put me into a good light, I think.
Obviously they will. There were lots of nerf battles, but I think one of our favourite pastimes in youth group was to tease Paul about his past life as a metal artist. Which, if he has not shown you yet his metal band of his teenage years, then he has to show you the metal. Was it Christian metal or was it just metal?
Oh, I mean, no, it was just metal is a kind description of it, really. It was barely metal. Terrible.
Lots of tapping on the guitar, a sort of emo haircut. Yeah, it's a delight to watch. So get him to show you that YouTube video. Yeah,
and I will not complain. I apologise, everyone. Thank you very much for that. Good. So John, we wanted to explore a little bit the question, I guess, that we're wanting to explore during the next sort of couple of podcasts is whether we can really trust the Bible. But as we've talked, actually, that is a huge discussion, because actually the Bible is not one book. It's 66 various authors, different genres. It's actually incredibly complex to answer that question. So your main area of study has been around the Gospels, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. So that's really what we're going to get into in this podcast, is how we can really trust the gospel. So I guess the first question then is, what is a gospel? What is it trying to do?
So I think this is a really important question, because you'll often hear on the internet that the gospels are sort of fictional accounts or ancient myths that were told about this divine Jesus figure. And I think it's very important to sort of nip that idea in the bud straight away by thinking about the question, what is a gospel? What is actually the genre of this text? And often we don't actually ask this question very much, because we assume, because we have the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that the gospel is just its own kind of text. It's kind of its own genre, just as we might talk about tragedy or epic or comedy. But there wasn't actually in the ancient world a genre called gospel. And gospel is just a word, it comes from the Greek word euangelion, meaning good news. But there wasn't a good news genre. So that's really forced scholars to ask the question, well, what kind of literary types, what kind of literary genres do the Gospels actually fit into? What is the kind of the genre that's most comparable to them? And
so whether these texts are myths or history or biography, all those kind of, we want to know what category they fit into.
Yeah, those kinds of questions.
Helpful.
And my sort of nothing that I say can be taken as gospel, but I personally subscribe to the view that the Gospels are sort of on the boundary of biography and history, probably closer to biography. And there's been a lot of work that's been done on this in pretty much the last 30 years, because scholars originally, when they were looking at the question of whether the Gospels could be biographies, they said, no, the Gospels don't look like biographies at all. I mean, they don't give us these kind of incidental features about what Jesus' life looked like. They never even tell us, for example, what Jesus as a physical person looked like, as the sort of modern biography would. They don't tell us anything about his early childhood. I think Luke has one story where he talks about Jesus discussing in the temple. But other than that, Mark, Matthew, John don't really tell us anything about Jesus' childhood. And also the Gospels seem to tell us a lot about Jesus' passion. So the last week leading up to his death. And Mark's Gospel especially has actually been called a sort of a passion account with an introduction. It seems everything's leading up to this death, and that's a bit morbid. You know, now when we look at biographies, say, a person, say a Justin Bieber can come out with a biography without even living most of his life. And also modern biographies will also focus a lot on the psychological development of their subject, so tracing that over time. And the Gospels don't really tell us about the development of Jesus' own emotional and psychological states. So for a long time, Gospel scholars just said, well, the Gospels aren't biographies, so they must be something else. They must be just like traditions pieced together, or something like this. And they don't really conform to any literary genre. They're just the Gospel, and this is completely unique. But what's happened in basically the last 30 years is that scholars have not compared the Gospels to modern biographies, but to ancient biographies, which is obviously a much more sensible thing to compare them to. And when they've done that, they've found some really interesting things. For example, ancient biographies don't focus much on the childhood or the development of their subject. And they do focus a lot on the death of their subject, because the ancients believed that how you died really confirmed how well you had lived your life. So actually the Gospels, with their focus on the person of Jesus is the subject of most of the verbs and most of the narrative space in the texts. They've actually said it looks like these are actually not modern biographies, but ancient biographies. And this has some really interesting sort of payoffs. And one of the payoffs is that there aren't any, to my knowledge, ancient biographies written within living memory of the subject that were about a fictional character. All of them are about a historical character. And so whilst they may not have exactly the same historical interests as sort of modern biographies do, they nevertheless have a historical interest, which is really important. And one of my sort of personal heroes, C.S. Lewis, was a literary historian. And he had grown up reading the Norse and the pagan myths. And he says, I have read Norse and pagan myths all my life. And the Gospels do not even compare to these kinds of stories. So I think we can immediately sort of dispel the notion that the Gospels are merely about a fictional character or something like this. Jesus is not comparable to Santa Claus, for example.
Great. Okay, so if I've understood you right then, so that we've got a challenge on understanding what these texts are. You're suggesting that they're biographies, but so biography being an account of the life of Jesus, but we shouldn't understand those in terms of a modern biography. We should understand them in its context of ancient biographies that feel slightly different the way we would. And one of the things so unique about the gospel biographies then is that that they're written within actually eyewitnesses, within the time span of people who'd actually seen and witnessed these events, which I guess is really helpful as well. That's really helpful. Thank you.
I should perhaps say something. So historians talk a lot about this word provenance, which basically means when were the texts written, and it's very, and who wrote them as well. It's very, very difficult to do this with the gospel accounts because they were written so long ago, and the titles that they were given, say the gospel according to Mark or the gospel according to Matthew, actually sort of show up a bit later, and so it's not always. Some people will try to argue for the truthfulness or the faithfulness of the account by pointing to particular eyewitnesses. But the point I was making there is just that these were written within the memory of eyewitnesses, and therefore they do actually sort of transmit something that's in large part historical about the person of Jesus, rather than necessarily written by eyewitnesses, although there is some evidence for that, and a lot of people do hold that view as well.
So it goes beyond being pure fan fiction or myth to actually something that reflects a truism. It reflects something of the actual life of Jesus from eyewitnesses.
Yes, and there is what's really interesting is that when we get so the Gospels were written in the 1st century, so within about 70 years of the death of Jesus. The first one was probably composed around 70 AD, which was Mark's Gospel. And then John had probably been written by, John, the last Gospel to be written, was probably written by about 100 AD. So these are written within living memory. So people in 100 AD would know people who knew Jesus, for example. Yeah.
Fantastic. So helpful. Thank you. So now we've got an idea of what a gospel is. I guess the next question is then, what are some of the signs that we can trust a gospel? How can we know that this is true?
I should just make a very, very quick comment. I guess I can link it to this question, but also link to the last one, which is that there is lots of fan fiction about Jesus. So there are all sorts of gospel-like texts, which clearly find their source in the original gospels that are in our New Testament. So, for example, the Gospel of Peter is one such example. And in the Gospel of Peter, Jesus actually comes out of the tomb, is extremely tall, and is followed by a talking, walking cross who is proclaiming things behind him, and he's accompanied by angels coming out of the tomb. So there was a lot of fan fiction, and people like to tell stories, and those stories had real meaningful theological significance, but they do look a lot more like fan fiction than the canonical gospels that we have. And so they are anachronistic, for example, which means they import things from their own time into the time of the Gospels themselves, or the time of Jesus themselves. And when you look at the time of Jesus, it just doesn't really, that sort of thing could not have happened. And I guess, therefore, that's the kind of the first sign that the Gospels are substantially and reliably historical, is the general plausibility. And so what scholars will do is to kind of ascertain what this plausibility might be, is they'll go to other sources around the time of Jesus to see what a first century Jewish person could do, what a first century Jewish setting looked like. So they'll go to people like, there's a historian, Flavius Josephus, who tells us a lot about the era. And there are these texts which were discovered in the 20th century called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they're really interesting because they tell us about a community or a fringe Jewish sect who was living on the edges of Jewish society, and it tells us about them. So just to give a few examples from Josephus and the Dead Sea Scrolls, which tell us that what the Gospels are reporting looks like the kind of thing that could have plausibly occurred. Josephus, or Joseph, Josephus is his Roman Latin name, tells us about all of these prophets who are leading people out into the wilderness and then promising certain signs. And obviously this didn't these signs didn't actually occur. And so what ends up happening is the Romans chase down these figures and they end up being dispersed or even killed. So when we see Jesus, for example, teaching great crowds of people in a wilderness setting, I look at Flavius Josephus and I think, yeah, this is exactly the kind of thing which looks like it was taking place. There was a kind of appetite for this kind of ministry in the first century. Or to go to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls has its own version of the Beatitudes, for example. So the Beatitudes are those portions of the Sermon on the Mount where it says, blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth, and so on and so forth. And so that there was a Jewish teacher who could have been leading great crowds of people, delivering something like the Sermon on the Mount seems completely plausible, given what we know about first century Judaism from other sources. And so that's kind of like the first sign for me of the reliability of the Gospels. Do you want me to go on with some more? Or
yeah, that's great, but just make sure I've understood you right. So this idea of, I guess the word plausible is really what that is does this actually work, right? Does this actually work within the overall story and setting and context? So the example you gave earlier of the Gospel of Philip, this piece of fan fiction, right? Having a walking, talking cross behind Jesus, you read that and you're like, this doesn't work in the overall storyline and context. This feels very strange and unfamiliar. So that's not plausible, right? But actually, when we look at the Gospels, what you're saying is if we measure them to other sources like the Dead Sea Scrolls or Josephus, that ancient historian, actually we can see that the sort of things Jesus did and said fit in within that wider sort of context. What are some of the other signs that we can trust a gospel?
So I guess the opposite of coherence would be sort of distinctiveness. So how does Jesus emerge as a distinctive figure in first century Judaism? I mean, why would anyone bother remembering Jesus at all as well?
Why does he stand out?
Yeah, and sometimes people have used the word dissimilarity to describe this. So you have a similarity to Judaism or similarity to Christianity, and then you have dissimilarity, where the things that are reported in the Gospels actually don't look like they would be made up either by other Jews or by other Christians later imposing their own viewpoints onto the Gospels themselves. So for an example of this is that the church had lots of elevated terms to describe Jesus, even theos, God, and kurios, Lord. But actually, Jesus' favorite term to describe himself is the term Son of Man. And that doesn't actually seem to get used a lot by other Jews or just going around calling themselves the Son of Man, or by other Christians calling Jesus the Son of Man. So there's a kind of distinctiveness there to that title that he is ascribing to himself. And I think the best explanation for something like that distinctiveness is that they were recording the past, and so Jesus used that term about himself. And so that's why it appears, but maybe that wasn't the term that they felt was entirely the best term to describe Jesus later on. So they just went with other terms. Because if you were sort of ascribing your own favorite terms to describe Jesus and not really caring about what Jesus actually said in the past, you might have Jesus just going around saying, I am the Lord of heaven and earth, and through me all things were made, and all this kind of thing. You wouldn't necessarily have Jesus using this very humble term, which is the Son of Man. So the Son of Man has kind of two meanings. It can mean someone who is just like literally the son of a man, so a human being, and often appears in context emphasizing the lowliness. I'm not even a man, I'm a son of man. I'm a lowly figure, which is what Jesus was in pouring himself out and becoming a human being. But at the same time, Son of Man is used in the book of Daniel to describe a figure who is basically divine and is going to rule over all of the world, all over the kingdoms of the world at the end of time, and is appointed in that role by God the Father. And so Jesus is using that term in a very sort of interesting way, where he's sort of alluding to both sets of how the term can be used, and it creates a very sort of mysterious effect in the Gospels. Who is this man? Another term that Jesus uses, which wouldn't necessarily be imported onto him by the Gospels or his surrounding Jewish context, is the term Abba. Now, the term Abba was obviously is an Aramaic term in a Jewish context. But what Jesus does is he takes this term, which would be used for fathers or for uncles, and then he applies it to his relationship with God. And so Jesus is calling God Abba, and he's also calling himself the Son of Man. So I think taken together, these very distinctive terms are actually showing us the very intimate sense in which Jesus saw himself as God's son.
Interesting. Okay, so we've got kind of this plausibility idea. So does it fit into this sort of coherent whole? But also you don't want it to fit in so much that actually it just looks like it's just being copied or replicated from.
Yes.
It's just something that there needs to be something that's distinct and unique about Jesus, and those terms are really helpful in that. Absolutely.
Some people would go so far to say embarrassing. So not just distinctiveness, but embarrassment. And they will talk about a criterion of embarrassment. And there are some criticisms of this, like the logic of using this criterion. But an example of something embarrassing the gospel writers wouldn't necessarily want to report would be Jesus' baptism by John. Because why does Jesus need to get baptized? And interestingly, John, I think, cuts this out entirely. So he doesn't want it in his gospel, and Matthew explains the criteria, because he explains the story and says it's to fulfill all unrighteousness, because it looks like this might subordinate Jesus to John the Baptist. Right. And so this is something that might be seen as sort of somewhat embarrassing, or the disciples are constantly embarrassing themselves in the Gospels and asking stupid questions and not getting things. And so there is an element of embarrassment as well, where you want the writers to include things that which don't make the principal characters look very good sometimes.
Kind of authenticates it, doesn't it? It kind of says, this is, we're going to tell you the truth, even though it doesn't always put us disciples in a good light, or even Jesus, like, here's some things that he did that we think are still a bit weird, but we're going to add them because this is the truth, which you wouldn't do if you were just making it up. You would just leave the good bits and miss out everything else, wouldn't you? So that kind of, validates it. Thank you. I reckon we've got time for one more, if you've got any more up your sleeve. One more kind of sign that we can trust the gospel.
I would just say that there's a kind of a distancing of the gospel writers' own views from what Jesus was himself saying, which again shows that they're not always importing their own beliefs onto the writers. So the example I think of this is in Mark, when Jesus is talking about, it's not what goes into a person that makes him unclean, but what goes out of a person. Then Mark himself, as the author, adds a little comment saying, and by this, Jesus pronounced all foods clean. Now, He could have just put that comment onto the lips of Jesus, but there's some kind of historical restraint. And something that's been known to scholars for a long time now is that Matthew and Luke are actually depending upon Mark. And you also see this restraint in their own use of Mark, because as they include portions of Mark into their own Gospels as kind of source material for their own Gospels, as they're telling their own story of Jesus, we can actually test how faithfully they are transmitting Mark, or how much they are just ripping parts out of it and putting their own things in and this sort of thing. And actually find on the whole that they are actually very, very conservative and very restrained in not just ripping up the sources, but actually faithfully transmitting the earlier gospel in their own gospel as well. So those kind of the general restraint showed by the gospel writers is also quite a good sign of their reliability.
Brilliant, John. It's been so helpful. Thank you. And I think just one question I wanted to finish on briefly, if it can be answered briefly, is these gospels should they be, how literally should they be taken? Should we take them word for word as gospel, as this happened, or are they trying to do other things as well?
I think this takes us around sort of full circle to the question of genre again, because just as biographies are not, they're not modern biographies. So also they don't always have exactly the same concern for historical accuracy, or they wouldn't necessarily tell a historical story the same way that we would write a modern biography. So often they will organize material by topic or by theme, rather than in exact chronology. And the gospel writers themselves do seem to have various levels of historical interest. So Luke, for example, when he tells when he starts his gospel, starts out by saying that, these traditions have been handed down to me from the original eyewitnesses, and I'm putting it together in a narrative which is going to be in a good order. And so he is really thinking historically. But maybe Mark less so. And John seems to be doing almost an entirely different thing altogether. So all the characters, for example, in John's gospel speak in exactly the same way. And so we see there that it looks like John is actually doing more shaping. And we would go, well, you can't do that because it's a biographical account. But actually, ancient writers did feel more free to do this than we did. And there is a famous account, I think it might be in Thucydides, where he tells us that when he didn't have information available to him as a historical source, he would compose something close to what would have been said, but he will use his own words to do that. So I do think there is some of that going on in the Gospels as they try to communicate to us the significance and the meaning of Jesus to us today. There is a certain extent to which they take kind of liberties, but these liberties that they take are well within the kind of the generic constraints of the time. And I would just say that we as modern people don't like this always very much. We have a real sort of concern for to take the Bible literally. And by literally, we mean factually, because as modern people, who have gone through the Enlightenment, which is just this period of scientific progress, we often want to equate truth, all things that are true, with what is factual. So we equate truth with facticity. And we assume, therefore, that if God is going to speak true words to us, then he's going to state a number of propositions. But actually what we see throughout the whole Bible is that God is talking to us in a number of ways, through poetry and through prose and through parable, and even perhaps on occasion through more mythological looking narratives. And so there is no easy way to answer this question, how literally should we take the Gospels in every single episode? Because I think to a certain extent, we have to look at those episodes and we have to say, well, what kind of historical effect was left? Because when I look at the resurrection, I can't help but posit something happened historically, because this movement is born after its Messiah, after their teacher had passed away. Whereas other things in the Gospels, I look at it and I say, there seems to be no notable trace of this actually in the historical record. And in those instances, I look at the text again and I don't just throw it out because it doesn't seem to be factual in the way I want it to be. I actually ask, well, what is the meaning behind this? So just to give one quick example to finish, Matthew repeats a lot of Mark's story about Jesus' death. But then when Jesus dies, Matthew inserts this portion about the dead outside of the city of Jerusalem coming into the holy city by the hundreds. Now, this would be the most, perhaps, if it happened in history, the most extraordinary event to happen in Israel's history. And yet people like Josephus don't mention it. So I could just say, well, the gospel writers got it wrong. I don't want to say, though, that they got it wrong, because I think by actually looking at the meaning of that account, Matthew is actually saying something quite profound, which is that by placing it next to Jesus' crucifixion. He is saying that it is through the death of Jesus that all of these people are going to be raised to life again. So he's making a theological point in narrative form that I don't think necessarily has to be taken literally, although some people would want to take it literally, necessarily to be taken literally to have real meaning for us as Christians and real authority for us as Christians as well, because we can't go away from that passage and say that Jesus' death does not cause resurrection life. We have to maintain that meaning as Christians when we read that narrative.
In many ways, Matthew is saying, this is what really happened, and here's a piece of narrative to help us understand the theological significance of what the resurrection means, rather than saying, this is exactly what happened word for word. He's doing something slightly different.
Yeah, definitely.
That's so helpful. John, thank you so much. Thank you for your time. That has been incredible, and lots for us to be kind of working through and thinking through. And really appreciate it. Thanks very much, mate.
Thanks for letting me nerd out.
Keep that in mind, we don't like your ways.
Well, thank you for tuning in to the first St. Francis Youth podcast. We'll see you next time where we'll be interviewing my friend Temitope Taiwo about his love for the Bible and the way he kind of engages with it as well. We'll see you then.